For members only, Golf Smarter number 354, published on October 23, 2012.
Welcome to Golf Smarter Mulligans, your second chance to gain insight and advice from the best instructors featured on the Golf Smarter podcast. Great golf instruction never gets old. Our interview library features hundreds of hours of game improvement conversations like this that are no longer available in any podcast app.
But when Hogan finished, he shot a 70 in the final round. It was his best score out of the 4 rounds. There were very few scores under 70 on that course. It was so difficult. And everybody thought he'd won. When he finishes, it's about 5 after 5. TV's just come on, and Gene Saracen comes rushing across the green with a microphone to congratulate Hogan and interview him. And basically said, you've won your 5th Open. And he even asked Hogan to hold up his hand with his 5 fingers to signify 5. And what I understand is that Hogan started to do that, and then he caught himself. He realized, wait a second, it's not over. And he said that, and he finished the interview. It was a very short interview, and he walked up the slope to the clubhouse and into the locker room to wait for the official end of the tournament. People thought it was over. He was 5 shots ahead of Snead and Bolt, who were tied for second. There's no one else out on the golf course who really even has a mathematical chance except this one player, Jack-Fleck.
Part 2 on the greatest upset at the 1955 U.S. Open.
This is Golf Smarter, sharing tips and insights from golfers and golf professionals to help lower your score. It's worked for your host, Fred Green.
Welcome back to Golf Smarter for members only, Neil.
It's good to be back, Fred.
Thank you. And we had prepped everybody that we were just going to go ahead and record straight through and make part 2 seamless so we can even have a good train of thought. Well, computers are our friends except for today. And everything that we recorded disappeared. And so here we are. Luckily, Neil was available, and we were able to record this just the moments before we were going to publish this episode. So if we are redundant in any way, I seriously apologize, but I'm going to try my hardest not to ask the same questions as I did on episode number 1. So, Neil, let's talk about your book, The Longest Shot, Jack-Fleck, Ben Hogan, and Pro Golf's Greatest Upset at the 1955 U.S. Open. I wanted to see if we could go over how the tournament went round by round. And knowing that in 1955 at the U.S. Open, they played 4 rounds, right?
They played 4 rounds. And I remember we were touching on this a little bit in part 1. They played 4 rounds in 3 days. So they played 36 holes the final day. And they actually did that up until 1965. 64 was the last time they did that.
Oh, interesting.
And that was after Ken Venturi won at Congressional in this terrible heat, and he practically collapsed. And after that, they went to 4 rounds in 4 days, but they're still playing 36 on the final day in 1955. And of course, in this particular U.S. Open, it went an extra day because they needed a playoff.
Right. And in that 4th day, and this is the thing that blows me away. So Ben Hogan was not, well, I guess he was fully recovered, but still he was probably in a lot of pain from the accident. Or still suffering from some pain, and he had to walk the entire 36 holes, and you wouldn't call the Olympic Club in San Francisco a flat golf course.
No, it was not an easy walk for him. And he would get back to his hotel at night and rest. He'd crawl into bed and rest for the next day's round, and then when he got up in the morning, he did the same thing. I think ever since the accident, he had this roughly a 2-hour regimen of prepping himself to go out to the golf course and play a tournament round of golf. And that was soaking in a hot hot water bathtub for a period of time, and then he rubbed the liniment on his legs. He wrapped his legs in elastic bandages, and he kind of suited up, almost like you'd think of a football player or something. But that's what he had to do to go out and play golf. And he walked. Players told me, including Jack-Fleck, he looked a little gimpy. He had a little bit of a limp, and his legs did hurt, and they would get stiff. But that's what he had to do to play, and he was definitely a gamer. He didn't want to go another 18, that's for sure, when they got to the place where there was going to be a playoff.
I can imagine.
But he went to 36 holes of the final day, and he played a really great tournament.
And you were just talking about, talking to the people. Who are the people, that were there that you had the chance to talk to in doing research for this book? What kind of additional information, beyond Jack-Fleck, what kind of additional information and insights were you able to get in doing the research for the book? Well,
I actually flipped to the page in the acknowledgement so I'd be able to recall the players I talked to. But I talked to Ari Ball, he's over 100. He's still alive. He played there. He's been around so long that he was friend with Bobby Jones.
Wow.
I kid you not.
Wow.
He played at the British Open in 1930 when Bobby Jones won what they ended up calling the Grand Slam. So Ari Ball was there. Tommy Bolt, I talked to him. Tommy died, I think, in 2008. Dow Fensterwald, Doug Ford, Fred Hawkins, Walker Inman Jr., who was a good friend of Jack's and played with him the first 2 rounds. Another friend named Mike Crack, Gene Littler, Shelley Mayfield, Arnold Palmer, Bob Rossberg, and Larry Tomasino. So there were some players. Definitely, there's still probably about a dozen or so players around that played that tournament, that played in the 1955 U.S. Open. And there were a few that I didn't get a chance to talk to. And there were a few who have passed on since I talked to them. And I was so grateful to be able to talk to Tommy Bolt, who's a Hall of Famer, and Bob Rossberg, who, some of your, I guess, 40 and over listeners will remember as a longtime on-course reporter for ABC. He also passed away not terribly long after I talked to him. And then another club and touring professional named Shelley Mayfield, who in his day was quite a good player and was also a pretty good friend of ben-Hogan's later on. So it was very helpful to be able to talk to them and very interesting to get their perspective on the tournament, this particular tournament, on Hogan, on the golf course, and how that Open set up and how difficult it was to play there that week.
In the stories they were telling you, I can't imagine that Jack-Fleck was a big part of their story from what they remember of that weekend until the end.
That's true. Some of them knew of Jack. They knew, as we talked about in the first part, Jack had been playing tournament golf, but he wasn't well known. So they might have recognized his name. They might have seen him around in tournaments. But guys like Rossberg, who was a pretty good player, he was fairly young. He was younger than Jack at that time, and he was kind of tabbed as one of the up-and-comers. He told me, I didn't really know Jack at that time. I didn't know Jack-Fleck. He said, I knew who he was, but I hadn't really been around him much. And he got to know him a lot better later on. In fact, just kind of a little side note.
I love the side notes. Side notes.
Jack's last victory on the PGA Tour, he had 3, was he beat Bob Rossberg in the Bakersfield Open in, I think it was 1961, in a playoff. So he had 3 tour victories, and one of them came against Rossi. And interestingly, too, all of Jack's wins came in playoffs. But now Arnold Palmer, getting back to who I talked to and what they knew of Jack, Arnold told me that he did know Jack. And that kind of surprised me. But he said, I knew who Jack-Fleck was, and I played golf with him prior to that week. But what he told me was, he said, we all knew Jack was a good player. He was gracious in his comments. He acknowledged that Jack could play. But he said, none of us really thought of him as being an Open contender, which made sense because Jack had only played in 2 Opens.
Mm-hmm.
He missed the cut in one. The other one, he finished 52nd. So he's just kind of coming out of nowhere in a sense. And some of the other players, a couple of his pals were Walker Inman Jr., Mike Crack, who are discussed in the book. Walker is really kind of a prominent character in the book. They're rookies on the tour, and they're kind of no-namers too, really. So most all these players, they were caught off guard by Jack's performance as well.
And that's what makes it such a great story, because it was, it's just a little train that could. I mean, he just came out of nowhere. How many times did Jack win on the tour?
Well, he ended up winning. He won 3 times, and this was his first win. Yeah, I mean,
this is his first of 3 wins on the tour, and each of the 3, you're saying, were all in playoffs.
They were all in playoffs. He won the 55 U.S. Open sort of coming out of nowhere and shocking Hogan in the world, really.
Yeah.
And then he won his next win. He had a bit of a slide after the Open. His game went into decline.
In what sense? And no, please expand on that.
Well, I think even like you'll see with some players nowadays, he did have some opportunities after he won the Open to do exhibitions. He went to New York. He was able to sign some endorsement deals. He was like the 1950s version of an instant famous athlete and celebrity for a period of time. And as someone who'd come from fairly humble means, he felt like for his family's sake, he needed to do what he could to capitalize on it. And it was estimated at that time that the U.S. Open was worth maybe something like $50,000 to $75,000 in terms of opportunities, financial opportunities, off course income, exhibitions, endorsement deals, and the like. Well, that was pretty good money. And so he wanted to be able to do that stuff. And I think like a lot of players, he thought he'd be able to maintain his game. And he was trumpeted for a while in the press, too, as this player who'd beaten the greatest player in the game. But it got him off track somewhat. It got him out of his routine, and it definitely affected his game. So his game doesn't really, it goes off the tracks somewhat, and once things kind of die down, he really starts to get back on track in the late 50s. And in 1960, he got his second win on tour at the Phoenix Open. And that arguably was his best year in golf in terms of his play, even though he didn't win something like the U.S. Open that year. He was very competitive, and he probably could have easily won 3 times that year.
Yeah, I've talked to one other PGA player. I'm blanking on his name right now. That I got a chance to play with him, but he played for 20 years on the tour, and he was complaining he only won 4 times. And it's like, you won 4 times on the tour. Yeah, but I played in almost 200 events. But so when you say it was his best year, he had top 5 top 10 finishes that year, not only winning the Phoenix Open. Was his third win also in 1960?
He won his third win in the following year in 1961. But this is one of the interesting things about trying to figure out more about Jack-Fleck and even some of these other players who I didn't know as well. You know, I'd heard of Tommy Bolt and
right.
Of course Hogan and Snead and Finsterwald. Some of these guys I'd heard of, but Fleck and Hawkins and some of these other players who were good enough players to play out there. You just haven't heard much about them because they didn't win a lot. And then what you find out was that they had some near misses. And Jack, if you look at his PGA Tour record, I think he had over 240 starts, and he had something like, he had over 40 top tens. I've got it right here.
Good.
He had 5 seconds, so 5 runner-up finishes in his career, 6 thirds, and 41 top tens. And one of the interesting things, I think, at least, when you read this book, the 55 Open and the dramatic playoff and all of that, how that all came about is detailed. And that in itself, I think, is a terrific story. But there are also a few chapters that follow it. And we follow Hogan and Fleck after there's an aftermath. And I tell the story that some of your listeners will probably know about, the 1960 U.S. Open played at Cherry Hills, which is where Palmer came back in the last round from 7 strokes behind and won. That might have been the greatest U.S. Open ever played, just because it was so exciting. There were so many guys that had a chance. But I detail that Open as well because Hogan and Fleck are on the scene. And with literally a few holes left to play, they're right there. They're at one point, Hogan, Fleck, and Palmer are tied in the final round with not many holes left. A lot of people probably might not know that Jack Fleck very nearly won another Open.
Wow.
And Hogan had another he had at least 2 more very good opportunities to win that record 5th Open after he lost to Jack at Olympic in 1955. So it's fascinating, really. And I wanted to be able to tell that because myself, when I researched this, you finish the playoff and you reach this exciting finish, and it's a tragedy for Hogan, and it's this great achievement for the underdog Fleck. And then, to me at least, I thought, what happens to Jack Fleck after he wins the Open? What happens to Hogan? Hogan, at the ceremony afterwards, at Olympic in 1955, announced his retirement from golf.
Whoa.
He was really disappointed, but that retirement didn't last very long.
Obviously.
He was back at the Masters the next spring. He just, he lived to play tournament golf.
Yeah. Yeah, but he was deflated. So when Palmer won in 1960, it was, again, I really think that we covered this the first time we did part 2 of this conversation, so I want to get into it in some depth. And please, if you remember me talking about it in the first part, stop me. But in 1960, when Palmer wins it, the media coverage is dramatically different than it was in 1955, especially the television coverage. Correct?
I think so. I didn't look into that as closely as I looked at 55.
Well, then let's talk about the 1955, what television coverage was in 1955 and what happened specifically with the U.S. Open that year on TV.
I think one of the fascinating things about this tournament was with NBC covering it, it's the second national telecast of the U.S. Open, the 3rd national telecast of any golf tournament. And they have an hour of coverage on the final day, which is Saturday. It's not Sunday, it's Saturday. They're playing 36 holes. And Lindsey Nelson is the announcer, and Gene Sarazen, golf legend who had won the U.S. Open, is doing the color commentary. And it's a lot. It's definitely primitive television by our modern view of TV. But they have an hour of coverage, and it's from 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock Pacific time. And Hogan, we may have talked about this before, but what was interesting back in those days, TV didn't dictate as much how these tournaments were played, and even how the pairings were set up. And what went on at that time was, when you went out on the final day as a player, whoever they paired you with in the third round, you just kept going with that guy. They didn't repair after the third round, which the fourth round is played the same day in the afternoon. So they didn't reorder anyone or repair anyone based on score. So Jack is actually behind. Jack-fleck is behind Hogan. Jack-fleck's paired with Gene Littler. They're only about 3 groups behind him. And Hogan's paired with a fellow named Bob Harris. And he finishes an hour before Jack-fleck. And when he finishes, the television coverage is just coming on. So it works out really well. And I have a sense that maybe the USGA had Snead, who was up there too in contention until he sort of faltered a little bit down the stretch. Snead and Hogan and some of those players had their time set up so that they would finish during the television coverage. But when Hogan finished, he shot a 70 in the final round. It was his best score out of the 4 rounds. There were very few scores under 70 on that course. It was so difficult. And everybody thought he'd won. When he finishes, it's about 5 after 5. TV's just come on, and Gene Sarazen comes rushing across the green with a microphone to congratulate Hogan and interview him. And basically, more or less, said, you've won your 5th Open. And he even asked Hogan to hold up his hand to signify 5. Hold up his hand in his 5 fingers. And what I understand is that Hogan started to do that, and then he caught himself. He realized, wait a second, it's not over. And he said that, and he finished the interview. It was a very short interview, and he walked up the slope to the clubhouse and into the locker room to wait for the official end of the tournament, and got an ovation, and people thought it was over. He was 5 shots ahead of Snead and Bolt, who were tied for second. Those were the scores in the clubhouse. There's no one else out on the golf course who has a chance, who really even has a mathematical chance, except this one player, Jack-fleck.
How many strokes was Fleck back when Hogan finished, approximately?
Jack, they didn't. I really sort of had to try to piece that together with the research, because they didn't have the modern scoring, the real-time scoring that they do now. But
right.
as best I could figure out, Hogan's finishing and Fleck is around the 11th or 12th hole, and he's about an hour behind Hogan. And at that point, when Jack finally got confirmation that Hogan was finished, and in the clubhouse at 287, there was a marshal out on the golf course with a walkie-talkie, and he came and told Jack, when Jack came off the 13th green.
And if I'm not mistaken, walkie-talkies in 1955 was 2 tin cans with a string in between, right?
Well, I think that these were actually pretty good walkie-talkies, because they were made by the Motorola company, and I think they were like Army walkie-talkies.
Oh, okay.
So this represented somewhat advanced technology for that time. that time period. But Jack finds out when he walks off the 13th green that Hogan is in the clubhouse at 287. And Jack is one shot behind as he walks to the 14th tee. And this marshal named George Tompkins, he's a volunteer. He'd gotten acquainted with Jack during the week, and he's kind of excited. And he says to Jack, all you need is a birdie over this last stretch, and you can tie Hogan. And Gene Littler, who was Jack's playing partner that whole day, and is a very reserved, quiet guy, doesn't usually say a lot, he overheard that comment, and he said, drolly, he said, he'll need a few pars too.
He needs, over the last 6-7 holes, he needs one birdie and to par out the rest, and he'll get to be tied, or that'll give him the lead.
When he steps on the 14th tee, he needs one birdie and the rest pars to tie Hogan.
To tie him, okay.
And so this is over the last 5 holes of a really brutal golf course.
So take us through the last 5 holes, because the last couple holes at Olympic are just deadly.
Yeah, and they were playing 17 that year as a par 5. No, excuse me. It was a par 5, but they
playing it as a par 4.
They changed it. It played it as a par 4, and this was a very difficult finishing stretch.
Yeah.
So
it still is.
The first hole is 14th. It's a par 4, and Jack hit a tremendous. He's pumped up. The adrenaline's pumping, and he hit a beautiful drive, and he hit it farther than he had been hitting it all week because he's pumped up. And he gets out there, and he doesn't want to know. He doesn't know what to hit on his second shot, and he can't make himself hit a 7-iron. So he hits a 6, and he tries to ease off on it a little bit. And when he does that, he pulls it, hits it in a bunker. He comes out of the bunker pretty well, but he's got it's not stiff by any means, and he misses probably something like a 6-foot putt. So he bogeys 14. Now he needs 2 birdies and 2 pars to tie.
Oh my gosh.
And he said at that time, Hogan's done. A lot of people have seen his finish. There's a lot of excitement. It seems like the tournament's over, but people start to hear that there's one player out on the course that has a chance. Jack has been playing pretty well, and his gallery is growing. But when he makes bogey on 14, he said that he noticed that the gallery, they didn't move. People weren't moving toward the 15th tee, and he thought to himself, they think I'm through. They think that I can't do it now. So he goes to the 15th, and it's a par 3, and he hits. It's not very long. It's about a middle iron shot, and he hits it. He hits a good shot. He puts it on the green. He has a medium length putt, and he rolls it in for a birdie.
Oh.
And so now he needs one more birdie and 2 pars, and he goes to the 16th, which is a long par 5. He was playing over 600 yards even back in 1955. Jack booms his drive, booms a 3-wood, and he still has about a 9-iron to the green, and he puts it on just the edge of the green and has about a 25-foot putt, and he rolls it up close and taps in for his par. So he goes to the 17th, which is playing the toughest of any hole at Olympic this week.
Now, I have to assume by this time, when he steps up to number 17, the TV broadcast, only 1 hour on NBC, is completed. They have crowned him the victor. All the East Coast reporters are here in San Francisco. They've got to get their byline in, and they've probably said, it's over. Hogan wins again, right? So it's like a fait accompli. Everybody is pretty much resigned to the fact that Hogan's won it, and yeah, this guy's on his way up, but there's no shot. And so the presses are running, right? They're saying that Hogan's winning, has won.
Yeah, you've got that. That's pretty close to what happened.
Wow.
The writers are they're in the press room typing up their stories because they're on the. It's tough. It's tough being on the West Coast because you have those East Coast deadlines, and they want to get their stories written and transmitted via Western Union. I think that's the way they did it then, and everyone thinks Hogan's won.
And then and also, wait a minute, Dewey defeats Truman. That wasn't that far before that either. I mean, one of the biggest gaffes in print journalism history was right. Dewey defeats Truman. Wasn't that around 1950 or 48?
1948.
Yeah, right. So now they're like, you'd think they'd want to like hold off a little bit. They'd want before they start printing stuff that is not necessarily true.
No, and so I think Jack came in. I think he actually finished. My estimate was he finished around 6:15 local time. That the telecast went off the air at 6 o'clock, which was 9 o'clock in the East, and that was prime time. And whatever was on primetime television back in those days was coming on for East Coast viewers and Midwest viewers.
And it was Saturday night.
Yeah, so he was somewhere on the 17th hole. He might have been all the way to the green. But there's a conversation recorded in the book between Lindsey Nelson and I don't know if it's a TV man. Either it might have been the director or producer on the scene for NBC, and they have this conversation. And the fellow's name was Tom Gallery, and he was when NBC went off the air and Lindsey Nelson essentially announced Hogan as the winner and winning his record 5th U.S. Open. This fellow Gallery was uneasy about it, and he as Lindsey Nelson was coming down the platform. It wasn't a great big platform, but he'd sat up on this platform. Gallery said to him, "You think this guy Fleck can birdie the last hole to tie Hogan?" And Lindsey Nelson said, "I don't think so. There's just too much pressure on him."
Yeah, that's a great observation. Yeah,
that's what everyone thought.
Sure.
In fact, there was a writer for the San Francisco Chronicle who. He just threw some odds on it. Now, this was before Fleck got to the 18th tee, but when Fleck was out there and he needed a couple birdies and a couple of pars or one birdie and 3 pars, he said he's got about an 8,000 to 1 shot. This guy from Iowa that no one knows anything about. All these great players were having a really tough time getting through this closing stretch of holes, just making pars. It was really difficult.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at a course where the average score was, well, I think I mentioned to you before, only 14 players broke an aggregate score of 300. And the first round, only half the field broke 80. It's a very difficult golf course.
Right.
Jack came in, and he tied the best score of the tournament on that final round. He shot at 67 to catch Hogan.
What did he do on 17 and 18? How did he end up doing? Where did he make the next birdie?
Well, 17, again, was playing extremely hard. And a lot of players, believe it or not, we're talking 1955, we're talking wooden-headed clubs. And these guys were good players, but this was a 461-yard par 4. The second shot's up a slope. Most of these players were not putting the ball on the green in 2 shots. That's how hard it was. Jack hit a great hit a big drive, and he hit a 3-wood, and he knocked it on the green. And he very nearly made the putt for birdie. There had only been a handful of birdies there all week. If you came away from there with a par, you were very happy. So he comes to the last hole, and he needs a birdie to tie. And he'd hit a 3-wood there all week to control his tee ball. Didn't really need distance, but just sort of knock it down into that valley. Mm-hmm. And then you have a short iron shot up the slope to the green. And he put it just in the edge, very edge of the first cut of rough, about 6 inches off the fairway, which I think actually worked out well for him because the ball was sitting up nicely. He was fortunate. It wasn't sitting down in the grass. And the pin was sort of on the right front of the green. So he had to make birdie, so he really had to go right at the flag. But with his ball toward the left-hand side, just off the edge of the fairway, he had the most favorable angle. And he hit a high 7-iron from about 125 yards. He didn't want to hit an 8 or 9 because he was afraid he put too much spin on the ball, and it would hit and it would spin off the front of the green because the green sloped from back to front. So he hit this sort of high, dead-armed, hands 7-iron that would come down and just hit like a stone and not spin very much. And he practiced that shot. He knew what he wanted to do, and he just executed it really well. And it flew up there, perfect distance, and just a little bit to the right of the pin, and so it landed and came to rest 7 feet from the hole. So he's got this 7-foot putt, and he's got to make it to Ty Hogan.
The longest 7-foot putt of his life.
Yeah, and this people who read the book they'll learn that putting is not the strength of Jack's game, but his putting was better this week than it had been before, and he had this good feeling in his hands. And the remarkable thing is, he said he wasn't nervous. He just went up there and he looked at it, and one writer who wrote for one of the golf magazines said he only took 24 seconds, which probably wasn't unusual in those days because the guys didn't take long. And there wasn't much to this putt other than obviously the moment, the biggest putt of his life, the putt that could change his life. It broke maybe an inch from right to left, and he just hit it perfectly, and it rolled, and it dropped right in the left center of the cup.
Oh, my gosh. Phenomenal.
And Hogan sitting in the locker room the last hour with reporters gathered around him, and they're getting, every few minutes they're getting updates on Fleck. And when the putt rolls in, one of the reporters said the building actually shook. It felt like a small earthquake. There was just this huge, spontaneous ovation and rumbling outside.
And in San Francisco, it could have been the earthquake.
That's right. It could have been. Definitely. So Hogan is shocked by this, too, because he thought he'd won. And I believe that when he came and he prepared and he sized up the Olympic Club golf course, he saw the way it was set up. This is a man who's won 4 of the last 6 U.S. Opens. He was a great player who was really tough in the Open because he knew how to play these tournaments. I think he shot the score he wanted to, and he said he thought he'd won. He really thought he'd won, and he did. He beat everybody else by at least 5 shots. So this guy comes out of nowhere and ties him.
Wow. Well, I think that obviously he ties, and they need to do. It's an 18-hole playoff the next day, right? On Sunday.
That's right.
So now that we all know that Fleck won, I think what I would like to advise the Golf Smarter audience to do is buy the book and get the details of that playoff round and find out how Fleck beat Hogan, how he was able to step up and go toe-to-toe with one of his idols and not back down and be able to beat Ben Hogan to win the U.S. Open in 1955. I think you should go get the book. I really do. It's called The Longest Shot. The Longest Shot, Jack-Fleck, Ben Hogan, and Pro Golf's Greatest Upset at the 1955 U.S. Open. Kindle version, or you can get the hard copy version, have it sent to you. And I'm sorry, Neil, I interrupted you. What were you about to say?
Oh, no. Well, I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt you, but one of the things...
Because I was plugging your book.
Yeah, I know. I love that. I should have never said a peep. But one thing I was able to do that people will be treated to when they read the book in the playoff is when we get to the playoff, we go shot by shot and tell, set the scene and tell everything that's going on. And we're able to go shot by shot because Jack is still with us, and there was a shot-by-shot account in the newspapers, and Jack remembered it. And there was a lot of good information. Plus, the Olympic Club historian, who was 13 years old at the time and followed that playoff, he's still around, and he read my manuscript, and I talked to him, and I did everything I could to get that playoff and exactly what happened. Get it down, and so people would be able to see what happened. And it's I think it's pretty interesting.
Very interesting. It's a great story. I'm glad you were able to figure out that it hadn't been written, and that you went ahead and jumped all over it. And again, I advise everybody in the audience to. If this kind of story fascinates you, then you've got to pick up this book. Should also check out, you have a regular ongoing, I guess that's redundant, sorry. You have an ongoing blog that you do on golf. Is that true, Neil?
Yeah, it's called Armchair Golf Blog, and that's really what led me to this story. Just through the process of writing a blog and making contacts and people writing emails to me, I got a tip to give Jack Fleck a call, and I wasn't planning on writing a book, but when I discovered this story and Jack was interested in working with me, I just thought, what a great opportunity.
Great opportunity.
The blog is something I still do. People can read it. I update it almost every day. So,
right. Well, we have links to it in the last episode, and we'll, of course, include links into this episode as well. Neil Sagebiel, thank you so much for saving my butt and returning to finish this story that disappeared from I don't know where or how, but I really appreciate you saving me on this one. Thanks so much.
But it's been a real treat for me, Fred, and I really appreciate you wanting to talk to me about this.
My pleasure. Best of luck and good luck with the blog.
Thanks very much, Fred.